This happened in the fall of 2025 during a sales trip through a small Missouri town. I'd spent the whole day driving across the northwest part of the state, visiting over 60 sales leads. By the time I got back to my hotel that evening, my mind was completely drained. Still, I had work left to do, so I logged a few more hours on my laptop, scheduling emails to go out the next morning. The hotel itself was a standard mid-tier place, not a chain, but not a budget motel either. It had this Western log cabin feel that turned out to be surprisingly comfortable. From check-in until the next morning, I didn't see a single other guest on my floor. That detail ends up matching later. I was on the third floor, which was also the top floor. Around 11:30 p.m., I was at the desk typing when I heard movement in the hallway, footsteps, a door opening, a few urgent voices. I didn't pay it much mind. Hotels are noisy, and guests come and go at all hours. About 15 minutes later, I headed downstairs to grab a water from the vending machine. The moment I stepped into the hall, I noticed a gurney parked halfway into a room 3 doors down. 2 EMTs stood in the doorway, and a man who looked to be in his 60s lay on the stretcher. I couldn't see his face, just part of his arm and torso. Figuring it was a routine medical issue, a fall or something similar, I didn't linger and quietly went back to my room. 10 minutes later, I stepped out again to finally get that water. This time, the gurney was fully in the hallway. One EMT was doing aggressive chest compressions while the other watched a portable heart monitor. I heard that unmistakable flatline tone, continuous and clear. That's when I understood the man was either dying or had just died. The EMT watching the machine firmly told me to go back to my room. So I did. When I got inside, the clock read 12:18 a.m. Even after witnessing that, my mind wouldn't settle, and I kept working for another half hour before finally getting into bed around 12:50. Only a few minutes later, I heard what sounded like 3 soft knocks at my door. They weren't loud enough for me to be sure they were even knocks. I figured it was the building settling or pipes making noise, so I ignored them. Less than a minute passed, and I heard the same pattern again. 3 knocks, but louder this time. I got up and looked through the peephole. The hallway was empty. As I stepped back from the door about to head to bed, I noticed the handle slowly depress. Not forcefully, just enough to suggest someone was gently testing whether it was locked. At that moment, a feeling came over me like nothing I'd ever felt before. I stared at the peephole, but couldn't bring myself to look through it. Instead, my eyes dropped to the strip of light under the door. Suddenly, the light vanished. It looked exactly as though someone, or something, was standing directly outside my room. The darkness lingered for several seconds, then the light returned. Right after, I heard a faint brushing sound against the outside of the door, almost like someone slowly dragging their fingers or the side of an arm across it. Then everything went quiet. Even though I carry a firearm while traveling, I was frozen with fear. I'd never felt dread like that before. I turned on a lamp and spent the next hour sitting up in bed watching YouTube videos, trying to distract myself. Eventually, I heard another noise in the hallway, a door opening. It sounded like it came from the same room where the EMTs had been earlier. Then I caught someone muttering quietly to themselves. The words were too faint to make out. Relieved that another guest was awake, I finally opened my door. A man was stepping out of that same room. He wasn't dressed like hotel staff or an EMT. He wore dark slacks and a white button-down, like someone on a business trip. He looked to be in his mid-40s. The only thing that struck me was his eyes. They were deeply sunken, as though he hadn't slept in months. Out of curiosity, I stepped into the hallway and asked if he'd been with the man taken away by emergency services earlier. He turned to face me. After a few seconds of silence, he nodded. Then he said there had been 3 knocks, and that the third time was when they answered. I was confused, so I asked what he meant. A small smile crossed his face before he calmly replied that they didn't always leave right away. Without another word, he turned and walked toward the stairwell. Needless to say, I barely slept that night. The next morning, around 8:30, exhausted and still trying to make sense of it all, I went downstairs for some coffee. I stopped at the front desk and asked the woman working there about the medical emergency from the night before. She looked genuinely puzzled and said she didn't know what I was talking about. I explained that paramedics had taken a man from the room 3 doors down and had performed CPR in the hallway. As I kept explaining, she seemed more interested, but told me that the room I was describing had been vacant. According to her, the last registered guest had checked out the previous day, and that guest had been alone. She also mentioned that occupancy had been unusually low the past few weeks, with only a handful of guests on my floor, all at the opposite end of the hallway. She then asked me to confirm that the room I meant was exactly 3 doors down from 312. That's when everything clicked. The incident was 3 doors away. My room was 312. The knocking always came in threes. And Mysterious Man's first words had been that there were 3 knocks, and the third time was when they answered. It was one of the most unsettling realizations I've ever had. It felt like I was standing in the middle of something that just didn't add up. I spent hours trying to explain every piece of what happened. Even though the front desk employee insisted no one matching that man's description was staying there, she'd only started her shift that morning. Maybe she just didn't know who'd been there overnight. Maybe someone forgot to tell her about the emergency. Maybe hotel policy kept her from discussing it. Maybe the strange man was just another guest playing a cruel joke. Maybe the knocking was only normal building noises. Or the handle never actually moved, and exhaustion from a long day of driving and hours of screen time made me imagine it. Maybe the hallway light briefly dimmed due to an electrical issue. I've even wondered if the whole thing was some unusually vivid dream brought on by stress and sleep deprivation. But no matter how many explanations I come up with, none cover every detail. What bothers me most is how everything seemed tied to the number 3. For nearly 3 weeks after, I wasn't myself. My mood was off, and if anyone asked what was wrong, I just blamed work stress and a few personal things. If I really had been losing it, I didn't want this story to be what convinced everyone else I had. Thankfully, with time, I was mostly able to move on. Still, I don't like thinking about it for too long. I still travel frequently for work, and thankfully, nothing like that has ever happened again. Actually, the morning after it all, once I'd finished talking to the front desk employee, I packed up and left that hotel as fast as I could. Nothing unusual happened during checkout, and I even noticed several perfectly normal guests at the far end of my floor. Even so, ever since that trip, I've picked up a strange habit whenever I check into a hotel. Almost without thinking, I'd count how many doors separate my room from the stairwell and pay attention to any room numbers or locations involving the number 3. Though the knocking that night always came in patterns of 3, it only happened twice. And that's the one thing I still find myself oddly grateful for. Because if I ever hear a third set of 3 knocks outside my hotel room door someday, I won't be sticking around long enough to find out what answers. This story mainly happened to my roommate Misty, but I was involved. All names except mine have been changed. This happened literal hours before I'm typing this. My roommate, who I'll call Misty, had a boyfriend named Paul, whom I'd met a few times. Every time I saw him, he seemed like a very chill, respectable, and actually kind of sweet guy. He'd roll blunts for me and Misty because neither of us knew how, and we'd talk about video games we liked. However, a couple of weeks ago, they broke up, and according to her, it didn't end well. She had to get a restraining order against him. Fast forward to 2 nights ago. I was playing SWAT 4 on my laptop when I heard the most normal-sounding knock at my door. I said, "Come in," barely glancing away from the screen, when Misty slowly opened my door and said, in a mumbled, quiet, almost drunk-sounding voice, "Paul broke my window and threw my clothes inside. Can you help me?" I could barely make out what she said. I paused my game, got up, and moved closer to hear her clearly. She seemed like she'd just woken from a deep sleep after having a bit to drink. She explained that her ex Paul had smashed her window and thrown in a bag of dirty clothes she'd left at his house. Mind you, she has one of those bunk beds with a little office space underneath instead of another bed, and it's right next to the window he smashed. He knew exactly where she sleeps. So that was pretty scary to hear. But I'm a bigger guy and know how to fight. And while he's skinny but kind of muscular, I wasn't afraid of him, just scared for his safety. So I reassured her I'd stay up, call the cops, and make sure he was gone. After calling the police, I stood out on the porch scanning the parking lot and the neighborhood street, but I didn't see anyone. Still, I couldn't shake this creepy feeling of being watched, so I told her to stay inside. About 45 minutes passed, and no cops showed up. So I called the department number to check if they were sending a car. They said we were second on the call list, and that it was a busy night, which tracks for the city and area I'm in. While waiting, Misty got texts from Paul saying things like, "Wrong move, bitch," and "I want my vape back," which she didn't have and couldn't find, so we figured he was lying about that. It took another 3 hours for an officer to arrive. By then, it was 3 a.m. But the cop was nice and took all the info we could give him. He said if Paul came back, call them, and they'd go to his address on file because of the restraining order. Fast forward to yesterday, just before I left for work. I had a gut feeling he'd try to come back before I got home, since I had to close and it would be dark out. At about 10:48 p.m., I got a text confirming my suspicion. The next part all happened to Misty while I was at work. Around 10:30, she left her room to take out some trash. When she looked back, she saw a dark figure walk into her room. Paul does have dark skin, but Misty is a little crazy. She'll admit that, and I mean it with endearment. So she slightly brushed it off as her seeing things. Still, she went and looked around the apartment for Paul or anyone who shouldn't be there, but found no one. So she sat down in her room and scrolled on her phone for a bit until she decided to get cleaning supplies from her closet. But when she opened the closet door, staring right at her was Paul with a blank expression. Misty said she went white with fear, but kept her cool and talked to him like normal, asking what he wanted. In a dead, cold voice, he said, "I just want my vape back," while she frantically but calmly, so as not to raise suspicion, sent me these texts. By some miracle, 45 seconds after that exchange, my manager said I could go home early since it was slow. I bolted out of work, called 911, and got on the bus. I told the operator everything that was happening. By the time I got home, the police already had him in cuffs. Misty had left to go to a friend's house to chill out after that. But she told me everything that happened, and I was shaken when she did. When the cop asked me what happened, and I got her side, even his eyes widened. He was taken aback by the situation. He gave me another incident report and said, "He's definitely going to jail. I'm happy my friend's okay, and shout out to her for staying so calm and thinking on her feet. And shout out to my manager for letting me off early. I still would have called 911 from work if I had to, but it was better for my anxiety to go home as that was unfolding. I had just moved out of home and started university when this happened. I was 18 at the time, living on campus in a small apartment. It was my first time away from my family. The apartment wasn't anything special. Tiny kitchen, a small couch squeezed into the living area, and a single bed pushed against the wall. Definitely not luxurious, but I'd made it feel like home. It was my first taste of independence, and I loved having my own space. One night, a couple months in, I was sitting on the couch watching TV when my phone buzzed on a coffee table. I looked down and saw someone had added me on Instagram. The username wasn't familiar, but that wasn't unusual. My account was public, and random people would occasionally add me. So I ignored it and went back to my show. Less than a minute later, my phone buzzed again. The account had sent me a message request. I opened it and saw a simple greeting. I didn't know who it was, but I've never been one to ignore someone trying to start a conversation, so I responded with my own greeting. At first, it seemed completely normal. He asked how I was, what I was doing, usual small talk. After a few minutes, though, the questions got strange. He wanted to know if I was single, what my dream man looked like, and eventually what I was wearing. I remember sighing in disbelief. For context, I'm gay, and that was openly mentioned in my Instagram bio. Because of that, random men occasionally messaged me with weird or sexual questions. It wasn't exactly uncommon. So while the conversation was uncomfortable, it didn't set off alarm bells yet. Then he sent me a photo of himself and asked if I found him attractive. I opened it, He looked to be in his late 20s or early 30s, heavily built, pale skin, messy brown hair, bright blue eyes, and patchy facial hair around his chin and upper lip. What stood out wasn't his looks, it was his expression. He wasn't smiling or posing. He was just staring straight into the camera. I chose not to respond to the photo and close the conversation. Almost immediately, another message came through, repeatedly asking if I wanted to play truth or dare. I declined once, then again, but he kept pushing. Around then, my best mate Connor came over to my apartment. I showed him the messages and told him about the weird guy who wouldn't stop asking. Being two dumb 18-year-olds, curiosity got the better of us. Connor laughed and suggested we just play anyway. Looking back, I regret it, but at the time, I was curious and already planning to block the guy afterward. I figured we might as well get one moment of entertainment before ending it. So I agreed. I asked the first question. Honestly, I don't even remember what it was, probably something stupid. He answered, then took his turn. He asked truth or dare, and I picked truth. As we watched the typing indicator appear, Connor and I joked about what he might ask. We expected something awkward or sexual, still treating it like a joke. Then his response finally came through. Instead of a normal truth question, he casually asked how I was finding life at university. Neither of us said anything. I looked at Connor, and he looked at me. Then we both stared back at my phone. How did he know that? I never told him. I'd never mentioned attending university or living on campus. I'd never met this guy before. That was the moment the whole conversation stopped feeling harmless. I came from a very small country town hours away. If I'd known this guy before university, I would have remembered him. But I didn't. I'd never seen him in my life. Connor and I spent the next hour trying to figure out how he knew. The problem was there was no explanation. I never posted about university or living on campus. Nothing in my bio mentioned it, and I barely posted at all. My most recent upload at the time was just photos of my hometown before I moved. The campus also wasn't that large. I regularly saw the same students every day, so if he'd attended there, I felt like I would have recognized him. At that point, I blocked the account. Connor and I spent the rest of the night trying to come up with theories. For the next few months, it stayed in the back of my mind. Now and then, one of us would bring it up, and we'd start puzzling over it again. Eventually, life moved on, and over time, I completely forgot about it, until 2 years later. By then, I was 21. I'd moved out of university accommodation and was living in a house with Connor and 2 other friends. One night, I was sitting in my room when my phone buzzed. Another Instagram notification. Someone had added me. The username didn't look familiar. A second later, another notification appeared, a message request. Thinking it was someone who probably followed my TikTok content, I opened it. Once again, it was just a greeting of my own. The second I pressed send, a photo appeared in the chat. I opened it and my stomach instantly dropped. It was him. Same pale skin, messy hair, blue eyes. No mistaking it. I muttered in disbelief, muted the conversation, and put my phone down. I decided to wait until Connor got home so I could remind him about the strange guy from university. I completely forgot about the unsettling message that made me block him in the first place. If I'd remembered, I would have blocked him immediately. Unfortunately, an unrelated emergency came up later that night that distracted me entirely. Since I'd muted the conversation and barely looked at my phone after, the interaction slipped my mind. It wasn't until a few days later that I opened Instagram again. As soon as I did, I saw his account near the top of my messages. I opened the conversation, and my stomach sank. There were countless messages. Dozens, maybe more. He'd been messaging me nonstop for days. Some were sexual, others angry, demanding to know why I wasn't responding. A few tried to restart a normal conversation like nothing had happened. His mood swung constantly between hostility and friendliness, making the whole thing feel completely unhinged. Mixed in were explicit photos of himself. I took screenshots and sent them to Connor, who was at work. At first, he didn't remember who I meant, but after I reminded him about the truth or dare conversation from university, it all came back. His advice was simple: block the guy immediately. As I was about to do that, one thought crossed my mind. How had he found me again after 2 years? None of my friends or family followed him. There was no obvious connection. I wondered if he'd just remembered me all that time and deliberately searched for me, or if it was some unbelievable coincidence. I try not to dwell on it. I blocked the account and changed my Instagram to private, figuring that if he ever found me again, at least he couldn't contact me so easily. Less than a month later, I was going through my TikTok message requests, something I almost never checked. Most were random scammers, ads, and the occasional viewer from my live streams. One account caught my eye because it had over 2,000 followers and it sent me a message about a week earlier. The message was just a simple greeting. Assuming it might be someone I recognized from TikTok, I replied almost instantly. The account responded by asking if I remembered them. I figured it was someone I'd met online and simply forgotten, so I admitted I didn't recognize them. They gave me their real name and said we knew each other from Instagram. The name still meant nothing. I asked if we'd followed each other before. They explained that I'd blocked them because they'd been harassing me. The realization hit instantly. No way. I asked if their old Instagram username was the same one I remembered from years earlier. A few seconds later, they confirmed it was. I actually swore out loud in disbelief. One of my housemates heard me and came downstairs to ask what was wrong. I explained everything, and just like Connor, they immediately told me to block the account. Before doing so, I sent one final message demanding they leave me alone and stop contacting me. Then I blocked them. By that point, this guy had somehow found me on two completely different platforms years apart. My TikTok account didn't even use my real name, which made it even harder to understand how he'd located me. That's when I seriously started wondering if I was dealing with an actual stalker. I told myself if he ever contacted me again, I'd take things much further. A few days later, I met some friends in the city for dinner. Afterward, I caught the train home and started walking back to my house. The station was only a few streets away, so it was usually an easy walk. It was dark, the streets were quiet, and hardly anyone was around. As I walked, texting my friends, I thought I heard footsteps somewhere behind me. I stopped to listen. Everything went silent. I turned around, but the street was empty. I convinced myself I'd just mistaken my own footsteps for someone else's and kept walking. A short time later, I heard them again. This time, after I stopped, the footsteps continued for a few more seconds before they stopped too. They definitely weren't mine. A knot formed in my stomach as I slowly turned around. This time, someone was standing several meters behind me on the footpath, completely still, staring directly at me. A street light above illuminated his face. Instantly, I recognized him. Same pale skin, messy brown hair, light blue eyes, heavy build. For a few seconds, neither of us moved. We just stood there looking at each other. Finally, he broke the silence by calmly greeting me by name, as if we were old friends running into each other unexpectedly. I turned and ran. I didn't look back. It honestly felt like my life depended on it. Thankfully, my house was inside a large residential complex. Once you entered, my unit couldn't be seen from the main path because you had to turn another corner to reach it. I sprinted inside, rounded the corner, and practically crashed into my front door. It was locked. My hands were shaking as I desperately searched my bag for my keys, all while staring toward the corner I'd just come around. Every second, I expected him to appear, expected a shadow to slowly round the bend. Finally, I found my keys, unlocked the door, and rushed inside, slamming it shut behind me. Connor and another friend were on the couch when I burst through the front door. The second they saw me, they knew something was wrong. Apparently, my face had gone completely white. After I caught my breath, I told them everything. Our friends immediately ran outside to confront the man, while Connor stayed inside with me. By the time he got out there, though, the man had completely vanished, no sign of him anywhere. We called the police, who searched the surrounding area much more thoroughly than my friend had, but found nothing. They advised me to keep all doors and windows locked and to call immediately if anything else happened. And they recommended I start the process of getting a restraining order. That all happened only a couple of weeks ago. I'm now in the process of getting that order, since I have screenshots of the harassment. I know his name and can accurately describe what he looks like to help identify him if needed. Even now, though, I still wonder how he managed to find me after all these years and across multiple platforms. I still wonder why he kept looking for me after I'd made it clear I wanted nothing to do with him. Most of all, I wonder what would have happened if I hadn't turned around that night and noticed him behind me. Would he have just kept following me without my ever knowing? Or did he have something far worse planned? I know I'll probably never get an answer. What I do know is that ever since that night, I constantly check over my shoulder whenever I'm walking alone, especially after dark. I pay much more attention to my surroundings than I used to, and I can only hope I never see him again. If anything else happens, I'll provide an update. But honestly, I hope there's never another update to give.